Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome to my last video in my series this week about the life and writing of Willa Cather. I initially said I was planning to end the series with one video about Cather's gender and sexuality, and one about her relationship to literary modernism, but I've decided not to put together that latter video right now. Roz and I did talk about that subject a bit during our discussion of The Professor's House, and I might talk about modernism more broadly very early in 2024. But I'm ready to wrap up Hannah's Bookica as we come to the last night, the night where I will be lighting all 8 candles on my Hanukkah and then watching them slowly burn down. In 1922, Willa Cather wrote an essay complaining that most novels were overfurnished, stuffed to the gills with material objects, and relying on visual representation of scenes. Instead, she said she wanted a bare stage, without a lot of extraneous material details, in order to emphasize not realism, but something much deeper. Her most famous line in this essay is this: "It is the inexplicable presence of the thing not named, of the overtone divined by the ear but not heard by it, the verbal mood, the emotional aura of the fact or the thing or the deed that gives high quality to the novel or the drama, as well as to poetry itself." As Roz and I mentioned in our discussion of Cather's The Professor's House, she seems to be calling very specifically for what I think I would name a modernist turn in the literature of the time. While I think most people are very aware of the actual context of that quote, the specific words Cather uses, the inexplicable presence of the thing not named, has been used as a nod to or a symbol of some secret embedded in her life that is perhaps reflected in her work. As I mentioned in one of my early videos this week, the fact that Cather destroyed or arranged for the destruction of some of her letters and then placed restrictions on the use of those letters made people wonder even more what secret she was hiding, what the thing not named referred to, if we were to imagine for a moment that she was talking about her life rather than her literature. Most scholars since the 1980s have recognized an intense relationship early in Cather's life with Isabel McClung, a woman some biographers portray as the love of Cather's life, although other critics are less sure of the degree to which their partnership was actually an intimate relationship, especially an intimate physical relationship. In addition to that relationship, as well as the possibility of a college relationship with a fellow female student, which I'll get to in a minute, biographers have, at least to a degree, recounted stories of Cather calling herself not Willa, but William when she was in high school and early college. She cut her hair short and dressed in masculine clothes. For several years, she quite often signed her letters William, often followed by the letters MD, and she told people that she intended to be a physician. Friends and family called her Will or Bill quite often during the cross-dressing period, and Willie for almost all of her life. Did Cather choose to dress as a man and call herself by a man's name because she saw herself as masculine? Did she just do it because she wanted to have the rights of a man to have a career that was almost unavailable to women? Did she do it because she was realizing that she was attracted to women and didn't have a clear conception of the possibilities of a lesbian identity? I'll talk just a bit more about that question later in the video. As many of my buddy readers this week and I have talked about, Cather chose to use male narrators in her novels and many central male characters. Perhaps she wanted to write about looking at women with desire. Perhaps she felt at least partly masculine, whether by choice or because of something more innate. Perhaps those were just the stories that interested her. One more thing about many of Cather's novels that I find intriguing. She writes her first 3 major young women characters, all of whom are, to one degree or another, androgynous in some ways, or even masculine at times, with names that are feminized versions of traditional male names. Alexandra, with Alexander at the core, Thea, with Theodore at the core, and Antonia, with Anthony at the core. This parallels her own feminization of a masculine name. It seems pretty clear that Cather is interested in gender presentation, although we don't know exactly what led to that. Today I want to talk fairly briefly about 3 books that add 3 different perspectives to the discussions of Cather's gender and sexuality. First is the biography, The Only Wonderful Things, the creative partnership of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis by Melissa Holmstead, published by Oxford University in 2021. A little background. For decades, readers have known that Cather lived in New York City with one specific woman, not Isabel McClung, but Edith Lewis, for nearly 40 years. The 2 of them did not hide their domestic arrangement. They didn't seem to have joined feminist organizations such as Heterodoxy, which actively included lesbians and bisexual women. But there is some evidence that the 2 women were involved in somewhat similar women's gatherings that were less political, but equally supportive of same-sex relationships when they were in more private places, such as the home they built off the Atlantic coast. Still, many literary biographers have given extremely short shrift to Cather's relationship with Lewis. Hermione Lee, for example, spends about 4 pages of her 400-page biography talking about their relationship, a 40-year relationship that lasted for almost all of Cather's life as a writer of fiction. Lee does show, in a quote, that after Willa's death, Edith thought of herself as a widow who could not see Willa in the past, but instead very much felt her with her in the present. But then the biographer turns around and casts it only as literary widowship, that is, the person who controlled the estate. In an interview, Hermione Lee even suggests that Edith Lewis was basically just Cather's, quote, slave. Holmstead turns her eye to Edith Lewis and her own paid work as an editor and a copywriter, and what she finds is substantially more detail about not only their intimate relationship, but the fact that Cather's work was actively shaped partly by editorial contributions by Lewis. Holmstead finds some of the early drafts of Cather's work and traces exactly what Lewis had marked in the margins and how they were resolved before publication. Instead of a, quote, slave, or even just a secretary or amanuensis, Lewis actively contributed to how Willa Cather developed as a writer. Holmstead is not trying to argue that Lewis's name should be on the cover of the books or anything like that, but what she does show really highlights how deeply connected this relationship between Cather and Lewis was. One of my favorite sections of the book gives examples of specific language that appears in advertising copy for women's hand lotion, copy written by Lewis and yet often parroting a male point of view. Wildly, not only the male point of view, but the actual imagery parallels passages in Cather's later novels. I read this section of Holmstead's book right after I had spent some time puzzling out what Cather was trying to do in some of those beautiful discussions about hands in her novels. And this is just one of Holmstead's examples. What a fascinating discovery to see links between their works. Next, I want to consider a chapter of the study Willa Cather, Queering America by Marilee Lindemann, a book that was published by Columbia University Press in 1999 before Cather's letters were open for quotation. The chapter I want to look at is Lindemann's analysis of a set of letters from Cather to her college friend Louise Pound. Between the 1890s and the 1920s or so, the word queer became a way to discuss The distinctions between what Lindemann explains were the still emerging categories of heterosexual and homosexual, as well as other distinctions, some of which had been in place for much longer. The first letter from young Cather to Pound says, and since the letters are now open for quotation, I'm going to quote not from Lindemann's careful paraphrase, but from the actual text. In the short letter, Cather uses the word queer multiple times. Let me read parts of it. It is manifestly unfair that feminine friendships should be unnatural. Following a party, perhaps celebrating Pound's graduation, Cather tried to say goodbye. I did feel queer. I shook myself after I got away, but it didn't alter the facts of the case any. I wanted very much to ask you to go through the customary goodbye formality, but I thought it might disgust you a little, so I didn't. It was so queer that I should want to. Then she says, I suppose we will laugh at it all some day, as other women do, referring perhaps to the then culturally accepted idea of young women having, quote, romantic friendships with other young women before they married men. But Cather says, it makes me feel horribly to think of that. It will be worse than if we should hate each other. Cather doesn't want to just put it aside. This was a relationship that meant something to her. And Cather signed the letter, William. There's a previous section of the letter that also uses the word queer in a somewhat different way when talking about Cather's parting gift to Pound of an edition of Omar Khayyam's poem, The Rubaiyat, a poem with a famous line, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou, where the narrator is speaking to a lover who remains ungendered. Queer here seems to refer to ethnic and racial difference, although Lindemann points out that this poem can also be read to support physical pleasure that might subject the lovers to, quote, everlasting penalties. Lindemann's point here is partly that it seems Cather is aware of the multivalent meanings of the word queer, and that she's perhaps self-consciously interested in making connections between them. Lindemann's book is far more sophisticated than just this little part I'm talking about, and it's excellent, but do be prepared. The book is academically rigorous and talks a bit about social theory popular when she was researching the book back in the 90s. I want to end by talking about a third book that is complicated and that several people have deemed to be inflammatory. I'll talk about these issues in just a minute, but my reading of the book is also complicated. The book is called Long Road from Red Cloud, Life Lessons from Willa Cather, written by Betty Jean Steinshouer and published independently instead of by a university press. When I first started my obsessive read into biographies and other studies of Willa Cather, I read the subtitle of this book and decided it didn't sound like my kind of book. Life Lessons. Was it a novelty book, meant more or less as a sweet little holiday present for the Cather lover in your family? Well, that is not at all what the book is. When I found out how relevant the book promised to be for the question of Cather's gender and sexuality, I tried to track down a copy. I put an interlibrary loan request out for it. My county has a fabulous interlibrary loan program where they can get books from other county libraries in the state within days, and books from both public libraries and many university libraries from around the country in a couple of weeks. As it turned out, though, my library's ILL could not find a print copy for me, nor an available digital copy of the text. I did find a way yesterday morning to listen to an audiobook recording read by the author. I've said before that I don't have the same analytical head at work when I'm just listening as I do when I'm reading text in front of me. And in this case, listening to the audiobook was especially complicated, partially because of the author's reading style. I found it impossible to tell when she was using her own wording or analysis versus when she was saying something was a quotation. And whatever supporting material might exist in the book, for example, footnotes or citations, was not read aloud. Well, let me go back for a moment about the complications of the book itself. Steinshouer, the author, is not an academic. She was a dedicated reader of the novels of Cather, the biographies and other scholarship published about the novelist, and the available primary material as well. Much of this investigation was started in support of Steinshauer's decision to perform as the character of Willa Cather at various events, including Chautauqua gatherings, etc. Although she's been dedicated to the subject for a long time, she doesn't have the training in the ethics of research and argumentation that academics receive. When I'm reading the work of academics, I want to see which sources they're using, to know what that source material says, and to see how they're building their interpretations based on that information. When I'm reading work by writers not formally trained to write academic work and not publishing with academic presses who have reputations for using peer reviewers in the process to validate not the arguments per se, but the quality of the research and analysis, it seems to me to be even more important to peruse whatever scholarly apparatus appears in the book, which one cannot do in most audio narrations. In this particular book, that evaluation of the quality of the research and analysis is even more pressing than usual because of the newness of the claims. When a self-styled scholar comes up with a major interpretation that multiple academically trained biographers have not made, it can be because that person is vastly overstepping in order to gain attention. Of course, it can also be because they come to the source material with a kind of openness and creativity that can mean they see things that those with more rigid or established ideas might not have even considered. So here's what Steinshouer argues. She says that Cather was intersex. The biographer recounts a letter from her father to his brother 6 weeks following Cather's birth, suggesting that Cather's parents thought of their new baby as an it for much longer than we might expect, perhaps 6 weeks or so. The parents, she says, initially gave it a boy's name, Willie, before deciding with the help of their family physician to raise their child as a girl. Steinshouer also makes an argument that Cather underwent multiple surgical treatments as an infant and also later in her life to address issues of what Steinshouer sees as Cather's indeterminate sex at birth. Since I cannot tell what is quotation and what is the author's stated opinion, I am not going to go into any more specifics here. Could Cather have been born intersex? Absolutely. The percentage of children born with some degree of intersexuality, is that the word, might be as high as twice the percentage of children born with Down syndrome. And even if being intersex was far more unusual, there's no reason to assume it couldn't have been true in any one particular child. Still, the evidence in this letter, and in what I could tell from the other sources in Steinshauer's book, just doesn't seem obvious in any way. When a father uses it for his newborn child and then uses she in the same letter, well, it doesn't seem like strong enough evidence to me. I can imagine having done that myself with my own child, who seemed part tadpole at first. Yes, people called her Willie from a very young age, a name her family gave her before she could speak. But again, that isn't clear evidence of anything, especially since we know that in that same specific letter she's talking about, Willa's father states that she was named Willie after his sister. Although the sister's name was Willa, it wouldn't have been at all unusual for the baby's father and his brother to have nicknamed their sister Willie, and for him to call his child by the same nickname. Incidentally, there is no birth certificate for Willa Cather, and Willella seems to be the name that was written at a later time in the family Bible. So we don't have formal support from other documentation that we know about at this point. I don't want to critique this book any more than that without reading the actual printed text. If I find the book really persuasive, then I might revisit this discussion here on my channel. Still, it is obvious that at least at times in her life, Cather expressed her identity in explicitly masculine ways, as I talked about earlier. Does that mean she was probably intersex? That she was trans? That she was a butch lesbian? We don't know. We don't always think about these words and even these ideas as historically constructed, but they were. And the way people understood their connections differed profoundly from one era to another. Even trying to draw clear distinctions between gender and sexuality hasn't always made sense. Let me end this video by sharing an exchange that Steinshouer recounts. Cather was spending time in Paris with her partner Edith at the time when Gertrude Stein was the host and the toast of literary society there. Stein had very recently published a piece that emphasized a new meaning of the word gay, a 6-page sketch that used the word gay 136 times about two women and their relationship with each other. While Cather was there, she wrote a letter back home to a close mutual friend of hers and Stein's, saying that she and Edith had been doing lots of gay things, but that honestly she was, quote, darn tired of being gay, and that she was really wanting to just be a vegetable for a few months. What makes this especially funny to Steinshouer and to me is Cather's use of the word vegetable, since fruit in this era was another common way to refer to gay people. Well, thank you so much for joining me for any or all of the videos I've made this past week about Willa Cather. During 2024, I may read some of her other novels, but at least for the rest of this month, I have some very different reading planned and some time arranged for celebrations with family and friends. I might put up a short video about some of those celebrations, but I won't really be back in the BookTube saddle until the beginning of January. Take care, everybody. I hope you will all enjoy reading some terrific books over the next 2 weeks, and also that you will get to spend some time with the people you love. See you soon.